Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Welcome back. It's the Koala Podcast. And I've got Steve DeAngelo on for part 4 of the adventures of Steve DeAngelo and his exciting life. And in the last episode, we spoke about Steve coming back and forth on the train between New York and DC, his engagement with the Yippies and the founder of High Times, and a range of other adventures, which read like something out of a Robert Crumb illustrated novel. But Steve left us on a cliffhanger last time. He was about to board a plane, and then what happened next, Steve?
So when I walked up to the gate, I saw this weird machine at the gate that I'd never seen before, with a conveyor belt. And then there was a sign up by the machine that said, due to hijackings, we are now instituting a X-ray screening procedure for all carry-on bags that are coming into the airplane. And so, but if it alerts, sorry, this is traumatic for me.
No. Take your time.
Yeah, let me roll back for a minute here, just to set the context here a little bit. Very excited to have these new weed connections that I've developed out of the Yippies and out of my activist involvement. Meeting older activists in New York, and in this case, I had been transporting weed, and when I sold the weed, the money up by train, and that was fairly safe. But in this case, my connection, Dana, apparently owed somebody money, and that person was leaning on him. And so Dana leaned on me, and as a result, I took the airplane up. And I wasn't used to taking the airplane. It wasn't something I did regularly. And so when I got to the gate, I was quite surprised to see that there was this machine with a conveyor belt, and there was a sign above the machine that said, "Due to recent hijackings, we are now instituting X-ray screening of all bags." It was the first time that I'd ever seen an X-ray machine at an airline gate. This was shortly after the D.B. Cooper incident in the United States, one of the first hijackings. And the sign also said that if the machine alerts and you choose not to have your bag searched, then you can leave. And I foolishly believed that sign, and I put my briefcase full of cash into the machine, and the machine alerted. And of course, they did not allow me to walk away with my bag. Instead, they called the DEA agent, who was conveniently there at the airport in his office, and he came and arrested me. And there was, quite a large amount of cash in that briefcase.
But how did it alert on the cash? What was? Do we have any idea why it set it off? I mean, if you just had cash in there, were you carrying any weed in the bag?
Well,
I had a little bit of personal supply there, did we?
Well, I had the cash wrapped in a black satin sheet. You see, I had to leave quickly. Dana was leaning on me, and so I just grabbed what was convenient. And, in those days, my bed had black satin sheets.
Yeah.
And so the cash got wrapped up in a black satin sheet. And apparently there was something about the material of that sheet that made it impossible for them to see anything in the bag. And so they said,
pure bad luck.
Ultimately, well, yeah, or, they saw me and, I was a young guy. These airplanes usually were for business executives. Yeah. They were expensive. They were like 3 times or 4 times the cost of a train to New York. And so there were all these business guys who were 20, 30 years older than me who were taking that flight. So I didn't really look right, but I don't think it was. I think it was really, they weren't very familiar with how to use the machine. maybe I wrapped it up in the black satin. There was something about that. In any case, it alerted. And so I found myself in an interrogation room with a DEA agent who was leaning on me to tell him who my connections were, because in that bag was about $27,000 in cash and a small amount of cannabis. There was just there was some weed in there that was so good I couldn't leave it behind. So there was a little bit of Thai stick, and there was a little bit of temple balls, and I couldn't leave them behind. So I took them with me.
Foolishness of the young, yes.
Very foolish, and so they had me with the cash and with the weed, and so I was looking at all these ridiculous charges. Of course, they love to terrify you by placing all these charges on you. So conspiracy to distribute, to import, to traffic, to this, to that. And he's like, okay, kid, you're looking at 50 years in prison now. You're going to be an old man when you get out. You better tell me who your connections are. I knew better than to talk to the guy. And I just told him, I'm not going to say anything to you. And he leaned on me for about an hour or so. He left me in an interrogation room to stew on it for a while. And then he came back and he saw that I was serious about not talking. And so he eventually gave up on that. And I was transported to the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center. And there I had a really harrowing, chilling experience that has stayed with me and informed a lot of my actions from that day forward. When you get to a new jail or a new prison, one of the things that happens is that you're interviewed by what they call the classification officer or some similar name. And this guy's job is to decide where in the jail you go, who your cellmate is, what level of security you need. And I walk into this guy's office, and up on the wall, framed permanently up on the wall, is a certificate of membership in the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, lovely.
My little hippie ass took a look at that sign and started shivering. But, later having learned and even then knowing about the racial disparity in law enforcement, I put myself in the shoes of my black and brown brethren, and just like how terrifying to be going into a jail, and this guy who can put you in with a murderer, right?
Yeah.
Or put you in with a shoplifter. He has that kind of control over your fate. This guy is not only a member of the Ku Klux Klan, but he feels such impunity within that jail system.
He can put it up on his wall.
This is 1976, and I grew up in a civil rights family. I thought racism was going to be dead in my lifetime. So it was a shocking and really, kind of infuriating thing. And then I got my really firsthand look at what, detention looks like in the United States. And it was very much, poor black and brown people who were more hapless than anything else, in some cases not very bright. In desperate situations, they make hapless decisions. But really, for the most part, not a threat. They were really people who needed help more than needed locking up. And so I saw, firsthand, even in that early experience inside, being incarcerated, what the deal was.
And so where did he put you? How long were you there? And I presume you made a call for a lawyer.
Well, I had actually made a call. I made a call. I don't recall when I made the call. I did make a call to my family, and then my family called the attorney. But I knew exactly, which attorney. I had that. I knew that much, and I knew not to talk to them. So it was not a bad experience as jail experiences go. The Fairfax Adult Detention Center was new. Well, no, I'm trying to remember it. There, the jail experiences are kind of like Grateful Dead shows and rainbow gatherings. They tend to blend together in your mind a little bit. So as I recall, it wasn't too bad. I was there for, 48 hours or something like that. And I got out. And, but I had to post, significant bond. I don't remember what it was in that case.
Did they confiscate your cash, or did you have that returned to you?
Oh yeah, no, they absolutely confiscated the cash. But here's the thing, back in those days, well, even still, well, not still, but there were a couple of times that I was seized with cash, and I was able to very cleverly create reasons that cash was legitimate. So in the case of the $27,000 that I was taking to New York, we said that cash had been intended to purchase information from somebody in Washington who had information on the JFK assassination. And the Yippie newspaper, the Yippster Times, had been publishing these stories about the JFK assassination that were basically exposés that featured secret sources. And so it was I could hold up the Yippie newspaper and say, yeah. And so unfortunately, the source reneged and they didn't want to do anything. And so I had to take the cash back up to the Yippie newspaper offices. And of course, I got an affidavit from the Yippie newspaper offices saying that all of this was true. And back in those days, you could skate by with an excuse like that. This was before the war on drugs. This is 1976. It's before Ronald Reagan got elected. So it was really a different era then.
So, I mean, two questions here. Family reaction and Dana reaction.
Well, Dana's reaction wasn't too bad. I later found out that this is a regular occurrence in Dana's life, that he has a habit of sending young people into high-risk situations without adequate preparation or risk management control. And so he's fairly used to this scenario. And he just went into, okay, how are we going to deal with it mode? And
it wasn't a negative in terms of that side of your life. But I would imagine in terms of the family side of your life, didn't make you the most popular child in the family.
Well, no. And, by that time I had been out of the house, the family house, for a couple of years. And I was, the leader of a Yippie commune. And I was supporting that commune with my weed dealing. And I was, quite disconnected from the idea of being a child anymore. I was moving and making things happen in the world.
Yeah, of course.
And so it was a little bit of a pull back into that family life. My parents were going through a very, very bitter divorce at that time. But again, to their credit, they rallied around me and they, appeared in court together. They visited me in jail together. They got over their differences to really be there for me. So I have to say that both my family and Dana were really there for me. They were supportive. Now, I had issues with my family. Like, the lawyer that I used was a guy named Marvin Miller. And Marvin was one of the founding lawyers of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And he had long hair, and he wore a gold cannabis leaf on his lapel. And my parents felt that he was absolutely the wrong lawyer for me, because as soon as he walked into a courtroom and the judge saw the long hair and the cannabis leaf lapel, anything that he said in my defense would be discounted from my parents' point of view. Well, from my point of view, Marvin was a lawyer that I could trust. And in those days, we had this saying, don't trust anyone over 30. And we pretty much lived by it. Dana was 29 in those days. For a long time, he was 29.
He was a long time, yeah. Well, I remember being 14 and always reading that and not even imagining what it was like to be 30, never mind trusting anybody over the age of 30. So, yes.
Well, you couldn't really trust them, right? Every time you trusted someone over the age of 30, they would snitch you off to the school authorities or mental health authorities or police or something. So anyhow, I could trust Marvin. That was the point for me, was that he was an attorney that was a movement guy. And I knew that I could trust him. And he would do things like, go along with this, quite ridiculous explanation we had to get the $27,000 back. But we got it back. We got every single penny of it back, and that was quite a remarkable.
So this is actually at this point, because obviously, as you know, the Koala podcast is all about law. This is your first engagement with the criminal system, but also the legal system, and using the legal system with regard to cannabis. So, I mean, would you say that you did a light come on and say, oh, I got a positive out it, there was a negative, but if I understand and can use the law correctly, I got a positive out of that. Did that come to mind at that age, or were you just thinking, thank Christ, I'm off that?
Well, yes. I was an activist by that time. I decided that I was committed to changing the cannabis laws right after the first time I smoked cannabis. It was right after that experience that I had in the park. And I knew that this plant was always going to be a part of my life. And I knew that I didn't want to be a criminal for the rest of my life. And so for me, changing the cannabis laws was a prerequisite for my personal happiness. And I in that moment, I decided that that's what I was going to do until that job got done. So the bust, which came 5 years later, really didn't really do anything to catalyze my opposition. My opposition was already deeply entrenched. But I did see the case potentially as something that we could fight on, because we had this search and seizure, and they had the sign up where they said that they were going to respect my rights, my Fourth Amendment rights, and they weren't going to search me. And then they searched me. So we actually fought that. We took it we lost at the trial court level. Then we took it to the Federal Court of Appeals. We lost there. And then we actually petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States to take the case. And they declined to take the case. And so
so that experience, though, led you to understand the process of how one needs to operate in order to change law.
Yeah, but I really just had contempt for the law. It wasn't like I was inspired to engage with the legal system to make reform or anything. I thought the legal system was absolutely corrupt, and I didn't expect anything from it. I wanted to scam it. I wanted to lie to it. I wanted to get out of being in trouble, but I didn't have much expectation, especially in those days, that that we were going to see much help coming from that. So it was a different kind of experience. And for me, the issue was that we had a Fourth Amendment case, and whenever you have a search and seizure case, then you want to fight it. You want to fight it as vigorously as you could. And to Dana's credit, he made sure that I had the legal resources that I needed to be able to fight it all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, that the way he did that was by fronting me more weed. And so, when I was already dealing with this one case, I was right back to doing what I'd been doing that landed me in that situation already. But I was fine with that. For me, the main thing that I looked at this bust was it was an opportunity to prove myself to Dana and to the larger weed world, because people knew that I got busted, and they knew that I didn't snitch on anybody. I didn't roll on anybody. I did the honorable thing. And so for me, I was like, okay, great. This is going to cement my reputation in the underground cannabis dealing world. And it did. It definitely, people who knew about it appreciated that, that I knew which side was right and which side I was on.
Carried on the trips between DC and New York. Business, I presume, picked up because you now had more trust within the community. What else was happening?
I was really, in a full-blown Yippie career at that point. I from the time that I was probably 17 until the time about 10 years later, I was either running a Yippie collective or organizing a big smoke-in Washington, D.C., or traveling around the country to organize there. In 1976, I went to the Republican National Convention in Kansas City, and we had quite an interesting experience. If you go back to like a Wayback Machine or something, one of the defining images of that convention and during that election season was a picture of Nelson Rockerfeller, who was the Republican vice presidential candidate, on his balcony in his bathrobe, giving, with a very angry face, giving a finger, flipping the middle finger. And he was flipping that middle finger at me and a bunch of other Yippies. And we were in a park that was directly across the street from, it was across a highway from the hotel where Nelson Rockerfeller was staying. And we had a permit for a rather large sound system. And the speakers had been pointed away from the hotel when we set them up. But early that morning, we turned the speakers around and we cranked them up to full volume. And we just started blasting Nelson Rockerfeller and provoking him. Wake up, Nelson. It's time to wake up. Wake up and smell the coffee. We are the Youth International Party here. We are here to greet you. Good morning. Because we knew that he had an appointment to appear on the Today Show. And the Today Show was broadcasting from an outdoor kind of atrium of the hotel. And we knew that all of that was happening. And so we wanted to wake him up early so he would be in bad shape for that interview. And it totally worked. This guy, we were just a bunch of young teenage pranksters, right? And we turned the speakers around and we hollered at him. And this guy, the vice president of the United States, he steps out on his balcony in his bathrobe and flips the finger at us. And that image got captured, as we knew that it would, by waiting reporters. And it was beamed out. It was like the defining video or photo image of that convention. And so it was quite a victory for us, But one of the things that Yippies always tried to do was, kind of do what would be called media hacks.
Yeah.
And so, finding a way to hijack the power of the mass media to spread our message. And that was just a beautiful example of the kind of thing we did. So that was, one thing that I did, traveling around the country, being what our opponents would call an outside agitator, what we would call, spreading the revolution and building unity.
And who were you meeting on the way? Which sort of characters from the latter part of the 70s? You mentioned the Dead, for example, earlier. Did you come across them, or they came across you?
Not really. I mean, I was there was a whole scene that was happening there, and it was kind of in its earlier days of people who would follow the Grateful Dead, and there was this whole counterculture scene. But see, I came from a part of the hippie world where we were political hippies. Yippies were political hippies.
Yeah.
And if you're political hippies and there's a revolution happening, then you don't go follow a rock and roll band and just smoke weed and hang out in the concert night after night after night. I'd have these hippies come and go, oh yeah, man, I just got off of tour and I went to, 72 consecutive Grateful Dead concerts. I'm like, well, what the fuck did you do to spread the revolution? Nothing, or almost nothing. And so there was a tension there between that kind of
consumption of hippie culture compared with what the original hippie ideals were, which were, as political and cultural as anything else. Yes.
Well, no, there were different strains in hippie culture from the beginning. So, like if you look at, and a lot of hippie culture was born in the San Francisco Bay Area. And generally, the hippies who were in San Francisco were more about going to the human being, taking LSD, exploring different spiritual systems, getting into Buddhism, dropping out from the mainstream system. And then over in Berkeley and Oakland, we were more about, taking over, right? We wanted to engage, and we were all about a rebellion and revolution and engaging with the political system and, doing the kind of things that we did at the Republican National Convention. That strain existed from the beginning, because you had in Berkeley, you had the free speech movement. And so that was, an overtly political movement. And then you had the anti-war movement. And of course, in Oakland, you had the birth of the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
So there was this strain from the beginning. And I would say overall, there were more peace and love hippies than there were revolution hippies. We were kind of the minority. Anyhow, I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about Dead Tour. And I also had a chip on my shoulder about the Rainbow Gathering, because the Rainbow Gathering is on the 4th of July. And the biggest date of my whole Yippie calendar every year was the 4th of July smoking in Washington, D.C. And I was like, why are these hippies on the 4th of July, a day when we can make a statement? Why are they all going out to the woods and just hanging out with each other and not fighting, not engaging, not pushing the revolution forward? So ultimately, many years later, after I wasn't working on the smoking anymore, I ended up, going to Rainbow a lot, and, setting up a field kitchen there. And Rainbow sort of became the 4th of July North Star of my calendar. But in those early days, things changed and evolved over the years. So, in 1976, there was still enough of a anti-war movement, remnants of the anti-war movement, remnants of the New Left that was still going on, that for me, I looked at Dead Tour and the Rainbow Gathering as a diversion from what the
escapism,
right? Yes, exactly. And but then as time went on, we went 10 years, 15 years into this real darkness with Ronald Reagan getting elected and the war on drugs. And most of the people who were hippies and had been active in the anti-war movement, even were revolutionaries, they cut their hair. They went back to their jobs. You even had Jerry Rubin, who denounced the revolution and wrote this book called Growing Up at 37, where he basically denounced everything that he had done. You also had the growth of these human potential movements, Werner Erhard, Est, the Guru Maharaji. So people were floating off from revolution into all of these things. So 10 or 15 years later, I started seeing Dead Tour and the Rainbow Gathering as these sanctuaries, as these repositories of counterculture that kept on, after the big anti-war demonstrations stopped, and after the underground newspapers ceased publishing, the Grateful Dead were still on tour, and the Rainbow family was still doing Rainbow Gatherings. And so I gravitated to those places.
So look, we haven't got long to run with this episode. It's an interesting time because it's a time of change in the mid to late 70s. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to wrap up, and then we'll talk about the Reagan years in the next episode. When did you sense, post Jimmy Carter, maybe, when that Reagan thinking was coming into play? And did you see it change? Did you see that there was going to be a change in your life? I mean, or were you just sort of young and still living it? It's just interesting to know that as we roll into the very late 70s and the 80s appear, and everything changes, in the US and across the pond in Europe and the UK, of course, in the politics in exactly the same way. So, my consciousness of politics is beginning to appear now. and we become aware of these things too. So I'm very interested from your generation, having been through that of the 70s. You've created a life, politics, a view of the world for yourself. When did you feel there was a backlash coming, and when did you first sense it?
Totally didn't see it coming. We were shocked when Ronald Reagan got elected. We couldn't believe it. So for us, in the Yippies, we were angry at Jimmy Carter because he had, on the one hand, endorsed nationwide decriminalization of cannabis, which was a big deal. On the other hand, he was allowing the DEA to drop this highly carcinogenic chemical on the cannabis fields in Mexico. And this is called Paraquat, was the chemical. And Paraquat had this effect of bleaching the cannabis that it fell on. And so the cannabis would turn this kind of gold color. And in those days, Acapulco Gold was the most desirable cannabis on the market. So unscrupulous folks in Mexico just harvested that gold weed
and sent it north. Okay.
Sent it up. And we were seeing, because we were in the trade, we were seeing this happening. And so we felt like, this guy who said he was our friend was now poisoning us. And, we had this not all of this is coherent, but we had this very militant campaign to push back on Paraquat. And we printed up these posters that had a picture of an armed Rasta man with dreadlocks and an AK-47. It said, "Stop Paraquat." And it was like, total Peter Tosh style. And we did a more thorough postering job with those posters than we ever did with any other posters in the entire history of the Yippies in Washington, D.C. You could not drive down any of the major commuter corridors in Washington, D.C. without seeing those signs over and over and over again. So we were locked in struggle against Jimmy Carter, and we didn't see this, this larger shift coming. And then we didn't really appreciate, how deeply evil this guy was, because to us, he was kind of a buffoon. He was cartoonish. He was
as people thought of Trump back in 2012-13. History repeats itself for those who don't learn it.
Yeah, there's a pattern there. What we noticed was, Jimmy Carter had this ethic of being open to the people, and he was unpretentious. Like when the oil crisis hit for the first time, his response was to turn down the thermometer in the White House and put on a sweater. And there's this very famous picture of him wearing a cardigan. And it was a really conscious thing to do. It was, it was sustainability before that was even a word.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of unpretentious, down to earth, folksy kind of feel in the Carter White House, and all the people around him took the cue from him, because that's what happens in Washington when an administration comes in. Their style sort of sets the style for everybody. And when Reagan came in, we went from cardigans and turning the temperature down to limousines, to diamonds, to furs. And you could just see these people coming into Washington claiming their power and flaunting their wealth. And it was that was when we first started getting a sense of how big the change was on us. But, what I was seeing, I think what I was occupied with was just seeing the counterculture and the revolution falling apart. And that's what I had been focused on, and our internal struggles with Jimmy Carter. And so
we're running out of time, and I think that's a great place to stop before we start the next episode and we explore, how your life then moved forward as Reaganism came into play, because I think that's a really fascinating point at which to move from one world into what became an entirely new world, really, didn't it?
let me give you one other anecdote from the pre-deluge. So one of the places that I went to organize a smoke-in was Lubbock, Texas, which is deep in the most conservative part of Texas.
Buddy Holly's hometown.
And so there was the organizer there was a young man named John Paul Jones. And he was a great organizer. And he put on a wonderful event at the university there. And I thought there were going to be 1 million cops, but not one cop showed up. There wasn't a cop to be seen. We had a smoke-in with about 400 people right in the middle of the quad, basically. But the quad was this oval, and that had a place where cars could drive around it. And so we were just, doing our thing. And we noticed that there was this car driving around, a red car, and it was, well painted. It was not an old car. It didn't have any police markings on it. It just kept on going slowly around and around and around. But on the side of the car, there was a shield. And on the shield, there was no writing, but there were 3 white crosses on the red background. And so it was the Klan. And the Klan the cops weren't patrolling. They just let the Klan come there and do it. And they didn't do anything to us during it. But the week following, somebody, presumably the Klan, firebombed John Paul Jones's apartment. And he fortunately, managed to escape. And I know that he got out of town alive, but he disappeared after that. And John Paul Jones, if you're out there anywhere and you're hearing this, brother, get in touch with me, because I'd love to talk to you about that. And I haven't seen John Paul Jones since those events happened.
Well, there's some research for me as well. Okay, Steve, thank you very much for the latest episode in the life and times, I'll say, of Steve DeAngelo. And in the next episode, we're going to go into the 1980s, a scary time.
A scary time indeed.
Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it. Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."